Jin Jae-hyuk built his empire on neon, blood, and the kind of silence that only comes from absolute fear. He never lost his composure, not once. Until the dawn he looked into his new wife's eyes and realized he was the one being hunted. The marriage was supposed to be a hostile takeover. Sign the shipping routes, secure the West African ports, and break the girl until she was just another asset in his ledger. But Chiamaka Adaugo Oluwaseyi wasn't the submissive pawn he'd been promised. She was a queen in a slip dress, poised and unshakable, holding a mirror to the hollow monster he'd become. When Jae-hyuk realized that his power meant nothing to a woman who didn't fear death, he faced a choice that would shatter his syndicate. Remain a tyrant, or kneel before the only person who truly saw him. That single night would unravel them both. If you want to see how their reign begins, stay until the final word. And hey, drop a comment with your country so I can see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The penthouse at the summit of the Gangnam Tower loomed over Seoul like a jagged glass tooth. All cold marble and rain-slicked windows. The kind of place where billions were traded in whispers while the city slept. Jin Jae-hyuk stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, his black shirt unbuttoned, the dragon tattoos on his chest twisting with every breath. He held a glass of premium soju, untouched, watching the neon lights of the Han River, with eyes colder than a Seoul winter. He'd ruled these streets for a decade. He owned the police, the politicians, and every shadow in between. You look like a man about to go to war, not a wedding. A voice rasped from the shadows. Min-ho appeared at his shoulder, Jae-hyuk's right hand and the only man who dared to speak to him without bowing. It's a merger, nothing more. Jae-hyuk's voice was a flat, dangerous blade. A signature on a contract that happens to come with a bride. Min-ho stepped forward, checking his watch. The Nigerians are already at the hotel. Chiamaka? Have you even looked at her file? Jae-hyuk didn't turn around. The marriage contract had taken 6 months of brutal negotiation. The Oluwaseyi family controlled the logistics for half the continent. They were the key Jae-hyuk needed to go global. Her father was desperate for a foothold in Asia, desperate enough to trade his daughter for a seat at the table. It was strategic, practical, Jae-hyuk muttered. She spent her life in the highest circles of Lagos and London, Min-ho countered, studying his boss. She isn't like the girls here, Jae-hyuk. She has a spine of iron. I don't care about her spine, Jae-hyuk replied, his grip tightening on the glass. She's just part of the package. A means to an end. The words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. But Jae-hyuk had built his life on such calculations. In his world, emotion wasn't just a weakness, it was a death sentence. He had no idea that by sunrise, the woman he planned to own would be the only person he ever truly needed. The rain in Seoul didn't just fall. It punished the pavement, washing the neon grime of Gangnam into the sewers. Inside a private basement club beneath the shimmer of the city, the air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the metallic tang of fear. Jin Jae-hyuk didn't look like a man about to be married in 3 hours. He looked like an executioner. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, the sleeves of his black shirt rolled up to reveal the intricately inked tail of a dragon coiling around his forearm. Across from him, a middle-aged man with a swollen face and trembling hands was pressed against a concrete pillar. This was Director Park, a man who had thought he could skim 3% off the top of the Busan shipping routes without the Dragon of Seoul noticing. Jae-hyuk didn't yell. He didn't even stand up. He simply watched the man with a terrifying, predator-like patience. "The ledger, Park," Jae-hyuk said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that made the air in the room feel colder. "It's a simple system. I give you protection. You give me loyalty. You broke the math. Please, Chairman Jin. The debt's my family. I can pay it back." Park sobbed, the sound echoing off the damp walls. Jae-hyuk sighed, a sound of genuine boredom. He motioned with a flick of his fingers. Min-ho stepped forward, handing Jae-hyuk a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. Beside it, on a small wooden table, lay two documents. One was a confession of embezzlement that would strip Park of everything he owned before he was handed over to the authorities. The other was Jae-hyuk's marriage contract with the Oluwaseyi family. To Jae-hyuk, they were the same. Both were receipts. Both were tools of control. "You won't pay it back with money," Jae-hyuk said, finally standing. He walked over to the cowering man, his movements fluid and silent. He leaned in close, the scent of sandalwood and rain clinging to him. "You'll pay it with the only thing you have left, your exit." With a sudden, violent grace, Jae-hyuk didn't use a weapon. He used the gold pen. He drove the nib into the wooden table inches from Park's throat, the crack of wood sounding like a gunshot. The message was clear. "I could have ended you. Now sign." As Park's trembling fingers scrawled his ruin onto the confession, Jae-hyuk turned his back, disinterested in the man's collapse. He walked back to the table and stared at the second document, the one that would tie his life to a woman he had only seen in high-resolution surveillance photos. Chiamaka Adaugo Oluwaseyi. He picked up the pen, the tip still wet with the splintered wood of the table. He signed his name in sharp, aggressive strokes. Jin Jae-hyuk. The ink looked like a bruise on the pristine white paper. To anyone else, a marriage license was a promise of a future. To Jae-hyuk, it was a death warrant for his remaining freedom. He was signing away the last part of himself that wasn't owned by the syndicate, all to ensure that his ships could dock in Lagos and Durban without attacks. "It's done," Jae-hyuk said, handing the paper to Min-ho without looking at it. "The car is waiting, boss," Min-ho said softly. "The tailors are at the hotel. You have 2 hours to become a groom." Jae-hyuk walked toward the exit, passing the broken director park as if the man were a piece of discarded furniture. He stepped out into the private garage, the humid Seoul air hitting him like a physical weight. He climbed into the back of the black sedan, the tinted glass shielding him from the world he had spent his life conquering. He looked at his hands, the knuckles slightly bruised, the dragon tattoos disappearing under his cuffs. He felt a strange, hollow ache in his chest, a vacuum where a soul should have been. He had everything. He had the ledger, the loyalty, the power, and now the perfect strategic bride. Yet, as the car sped toward the Shilla Hotel, Jin Jae-hyuk felt like a man walking toward his own gallows. He expected a wife who would shrink from the darkness in his eyes. He expected a woman he could break by midnight and forget by breakfast. He didn't realize that for the first time in his life, he had signed a contract he couldn't control. He was the notorious boss, the dragon of Gangnam. But as he watched the rain blur the city lights, he looked, for just a fleeting second, profoundly, utterly alone. He adjusted his collar, masking the ink on his neck, and prepared to meet his merchandise. He had no idea that by dawn, the merchandise would be the only thing holding his shattered pieces together. The descent into Incheon International Airport felt less like a landing and more like a fall from grace. Chiamaka Adaugo Oluwaseyi sat in the plush leather interior of the private Gulfstream, her gaze fixed on the gray smudge of the Korean coastline rising through the mist. Beside her, a traditional silk geli rested on a velvet cushion, a crown she wasn't yet ready to wear. Her father's voice, a booming baritone that had commanded the Lagos shipping docks for 30 years, echoed in her mind. "You are an Oluwaseyi. You do not just enter a room, you own the air inside it. Jin Jae-hyuk is a dragon. Yes, but even dragons can be harnessed." To her father, this was a masterpiece of diplomacy. To Chiamaka, it was a beautiful cage built of iron and logistics. She adjusted the cuff of her silk blouse, her movements precise and deliberate. She had spent her life being the perfect daughter, the London-educated strategist, the polyglot, the bridge between her family's Nigerian empire and the world. But Seoul was different. Seoul was cold, and the man waiting for her was a legend written in scars and silence. As the plane taxied to a private hangar, the cabin door opened to a rush of damp, chilly air. Waiting on the tarmac was a fleet of black sedans, a phalanx of men in identical dark suits standing at attention. At the center stood Min-ho, Jae-hyuk's right hand, his expression an unreadable mask of professional courtesy. Chiamaka descended the stairs with a poise that made the wind seem to stop. She didn't hurry. She didn't look down. She met Min-ho's eyes with a level, honey-amber gaze that made the younger man blink. "Welcome to Seoul, Ms. Oluwaseyi," Min-ho said, bowing low. "The chairman sends his regrets. Business required his immediate attention." "The chairman is a busy man, I expect," Chiamaka replied, her voice smooth and resonant, carrying the melodic lilt of her heritage. "But do tell him that while business may be his priority, I am not a business meeting. I do not wait in lobbies." Min-ho's mask slipped for a fraction of a second. He had expected a woman overwhelmed by the scale of the city, perhaps a girl trembling at the thought of the monster of Gangnam. He found instead a woman who spoke as if she already held the keys to the palace. The drive through the city was a blur of steel and glass. Chiamaka watched the neon signs flicker past, the Korean characters glowing like alien runes. She felt the weight of her family's legacy pressing against her chest. The thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on this merger. The pride of a father who saw her as his greatest asset. She was a foreign rose, transplanted into frozen soil, expected to bloom on command. They arrived at the Shilla Hotel, a fortress of luxury where the air smelled of lilies and expensive floor wax. Chiamaka was ushered into a suite that overlooked the Namsan Tower, a sprawling expanse of minimalist design. In the center of the room, draped over a mannequin, was the wedding dress, a stark, architectural white gown that looked more like armor than silk. Her aunt, Funk, paced the room, her voice a frantic whisper. "Amaka, look at this place. It is a tomb. The men outside, they have guns under those suits. Are you sure? We can still call your father. We can find another way." Chiamaka walked to the window, pressing her hand against the glass. "There is no other way, Auntie. My father didn't send me here to be a wife. He sent me here to be an anchor. If I flinch now, the dragon will swallow us whole." "But they call him a butcher," Funk hissed. "Then I shall be the one to teach him the value of the meat," Chiamaka said, her voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous calm. She turned away from the window and walked toward the mannequin. She touched the fabric of the dress, her fingers steady. She knew the stories of Jin Jae-hyuk. She knew he was a man who broke bones as easily as he broke promises. She knew the city whispered that he had no heart, only a ledger where his soul used to be. But as she looked at her reflection in the full-length mirror, the rich mahogany of her skin contrasting against the pale room, her natural curls framed by the soft light, she didn't see a victim. She saw the daughter of the African coast, a woman whose ancestors had survived empires and oceans. She began to undress, preparing for the gala that would seal her fate. She didn't need a dragon's fire to stay warm in this cold city. She had her own. By the time the sun set over Seoul, she would walk down the aisle not as a sacrifice, but as a silent storm. The monster of Gangnam was expecting a pawn to move across his board. He had no idea that the game had already changed, and she was the only one who knew the new rules. The ballroom of the Shilla Hotel was a cathedral of glass and cold ambition. Thousands of white orchids hung from the ceiling, their scent cloying and heavy, like incense at a funeral. To the outside world, the photographers from the Seoul elite journals and the silent, stony-faced associates lining the walls. It was the wedding of the century. To the two people standing at the center of the gilded cage, it was a high-stakes negotiation disguised as a sacrament. Jin Jae-hyuk stood at the altar, his posture as rigid as the steel bones of the building. He wore a tuxedo that cost more than most men earned in a year, the black fabric absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. His messy dark hair had been slicked back, but a few rebellious strands fell over his forehead, giving him the look of a fallen angel forced into a costume. Beneath the starched white collar, the ink of his dragon tattoos hummed against his skin, a reminder of who he truly was. A man who preferred the grit of the docks to the glitter of the ballroom. He watched the double doors at the end of the aisle with a clinical detachment. He was looking for a weakness. He was looking for the flinch, the tear, or the hesitation that would confirm his dominance before the first vow was even spoken. Then the music shifted, a deep, rhythmic cello melody that felt less like a wedding march and more like a heartbeat. The doors swung open, and Chiamaka Adaugo Oluwaseyi stepped into the light. A collective breath caught in the room. She was a vision of terrifying elegance. The architectural white gown clung to her with a precision that highlighted her poise, but it was the woman herself who commanded the space. Her natural curls were pinned back with diamond-encrusted combs that caught the chandelier light, and her skin, a deep, rich mahogany, glowed with a defiant radiance against the stark white of her veil. She didn't walk. She glided. Her gaze wasn't fixed on the flowers or the crowd, but directly on Jae-hyuk. As she moved closer, he realized with a jolt of irritation that she wasn't trembling. Her hands were steady on her bouquet, and her expression was one of quiet, dominant composure. Behind that mask, Chiamaka felt the private dread like a physical weight in her stomach. Every step was a battle against the instinct to turn and run back to the airport. She could feel the predatory eyes of the Korean syndicate elders, men who viewed her as a foreign curiosity at best and a stain on their tradition at worst. She felt the heavy expectations of her father, whose legacy was riding on her ability to survive this man. But as she reached the altar and took Jae-hyuk's hand, she made a choice. She let her fingers rest in his, not like a captive, but like an equal. His hand was large, calloused, and surprisingly warm. She looked up at him, meeting those sharp Asian features and eyes that were supposed to be colder than the Han River. Up close, she saw the exhaustion etched into the corners of his mouth, the faint shadow of the man who had spent his mornings settling debts with blood. The officiant began the ceremony, the Korean words echoing through the silent hall. Jae-hyuk spoke his vows in a flat, monotone voice, treating the words like clauses in a contract. I will protect. I will provide. I will honor the alliance. When it was Chiamaka's turn, she spoke her vows in a clear, resonant tone that carried to the back of the room. She spoke them in English, her voice steady and melodic. I take you, Jin Jae-hyuk, not for what you own, but for the empire we shall build. I do not promise to obey. I promise to stand beside you. A murmur rippled through the pews. It wasn't the traditional script. It was a declaration of war. Jae-hyuk's eyes narrowed. He looked down at her, his grip on her hand tightening instinctively. For the first time, he wasn't looking at merchandise. He was looking at a person. He saw the flicker of private dread in the depths of her amber eyes, but he also saw the iron will she was using to crush it. The rings, the officiant prompted. Jae-hyuk slid the diamond band onto Chiamaka's finger. It was a heavy, cold weight. To him, it was a brand. To her, it was a shield. You may kiss the bride. The room went deathly silent. This was the moment of public theater. Jae-hyuk leaned in, his shadow falling over her. He expected her to pull back, to show the fear that he was used to seeing in everyone he touched. Instead, Chiamaka tilted her chin up. She didn't wait for him to claim the kiss. She met him halfway. His lips were firm, tasting of expensive whiskey and the cold night air. It was a brief, sterile contact, a formal seal on a business deal, but in that split second, a spark of pure, unadulterated tension flashed between them. It wasn't love. It was the recognition of two predators realizing they were trapped in the same cage. As they turned to face the crowd as husband and wife, the applause was polite and hollow. Jae-hyuk raised their joined hands, a display of mafia power that signaled to his rivals that the Atlantic routes were now his. He looked like the victor, But as Chiamaka stood there, poised and unshakable in her white armor, she looked at the monster of Gangnam and saw something no one else did. She saw the cracks in his armor. She saw a man who had built a throne of bones because he was afraid of being alone on the ground. The ceremony was over. The contract was sealed. But as they walked back down the aisle, the air between them was electric with the one thing Jae-hyuk hadn't planned for. A challenge. The dragon had his bride. But as the sun began to dip below the Seoul skyline, the real battle was only just beginning. They were married by the law and by the blood of their families. But by the time they reached the reception, Chiamaka knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't be the one who broke. Jae-hyuk glanced at her as they stepped into the private elevator, his messy hair falling over his tired eyes. He looked shaken, though he tried to hide it. "You didn't flinch?" he muttered, his voice a low rasp. "I have nothing to flinch at, Chairman," she replied, her voice smooth as silk. "We are partners now, and I suggest you get used to the fact that I don't move for anyone." The elevator doors closed, leaving them in a silence that was far more dangerous than the crowded ballroom. The wedding was finished. The night had just begun. The penthouse suite was a tomb of glass and silence, illuminated only by the rhythmic pulse of Seoul's neon arteries far below. Jin Jae-hyuk entered first, his movements jagged, the heavy weight of the day's violence and theater finally catching up to his bones. He didn't wait for Chiamaka. He walked straight to the mahogany bar, the crystal decanter clinking against a glass as he poured a double measure of whiskey. He needed the burn. He needed something to ground him before he performed the final act of this hostile takeover. Chiamaka entered behind him, the whisper of her white silk slip dress against the marble floor the only sound in the room. She had shed the heavy architectural gown and the veil, appearing now in a garment that was devastatingly simple. She didn't head for the bed, nor did she cower in the corners of the shadows. She walked to the center of the room and waited, her natural curls framed by the moonlight, her expression as tranquil as a deep-water lake. Jae-hyuk downed the whiskey and turned, his unbuttoned shirt hanging loose, the dragon tattoos on his chest appearing to writhe in the dim light. He wanted to see her break. He needed the satisfaction of seeing the foreign rose wilt under the heat of his gaze. He took a predatory step toward her, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "You've played your part well today, Chiamaka," he said, stopped inches from her. "The world thinks I've bought myself a queen. But let's be clear, contracts are signed in ink, but they are sealed in private. You are here because I allow it. You belong to the syndicate now." He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering near her throat, expecting her to flinch, to gasp, to show the terror that usually paved his way. Instead, Chiamaka didn't move. She didn't even blink. She looked up into his sharp Asian features, her amber eyes searching his with a clinical, soul-deep intensity. "Is that what you tell yourself, Jae-hyuk?" she asked, her voice a calm, melodic contrast to his jagged rasp. "That you own me? That you've added another shipping route to your ledger? I don't just tell myself. I know it," he snapped, his grip tightening slightly on the air between them. "I am the man who broke every rival in this city. I am the man people pray they never meet in the dark." "No," she said softly, stepping even closer, forcing him to either retreat or touch her. "You are a man who is terrified of the silence. Look at you. Your hands are shaking, not from rage, but from the weight of maintaining a ghost. You've spent 10 years building a throne out of bones just so no one can get close enough to see how hollow you are." Jae-hyuk felt a physical jolt, as if she had driven a blade between his ribs. He tried to summon his coldness, his professional detachment, but Chiamaka's gaze was a mirror he couldn't look away from. She wasn't fighting him. She was observing him. She was seeing the messy hair, the unbuttoned shirt, and the profound, crushing exhaustion he had tried to bury under layers of blood and ego. "You think you're a monster," she continued, her voice steady and relentless. But a monster feels nothing. You feel everything, don't you? Every death, every deal, every lie. You're not breaking me tonight, Jae-hyuk. You're just trying to find someone who will finally tell you that it's okay to stop. Shut up, he hissed. But the command lacked its usual lethal edge. His hand dropped from her throat to her shoulder, his fingers digging into the silk, but the aggression was melting into a desperate, frantic need for friction. You are so lonely that you had to buy a bride just to have someone in the room who isn't paid to be there, Chiamaka whispered. She reached up, her mahogany fingers resting gently over the dragon ink on his chest, right over his pounding heart. But you can't buy me, and you can't break me, because I am the only person in this city who isn't afraid of the man behind the dragon. Jae-hyuk's breath hitched. The walls he had built around his soul, the ones that had survived gang wars and betrayals, began to crumble under the weight of her simple, devastating truth. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a pawn, but a sanctuary. He saw a woman who had seen the worst of him in a single day and hadn't turned away. The monster of Gangnam suddenly felt very small. His knees felt weak, the whiskey doing nothing to dull the sudden, sharp ache of being seen. He stumbled back, his hand falling away from her, and slumped against the edge of the dresser. He looked visibly shaken, his head dropping as he gripped the wood until his knuckles turned white. The silence of the room was no longer a tomb. It was a confession. I expected. He began, his voice breaking, no longer the boss, just a man drained of his own myths. I expected you to hate me. I expected you to fight. I am fighting, Chiamaka said, walking over to him. She didn't touch him this time, but her presence was a warm, poised weight. I am fighting for the man you've forgotten you were. The business deal is over, Jae-hyuk. The night is almost gone. Look at the window. He looked. The horizon over Seoul was beginning to bleed a pale, bruised purple. The first light of dawn was catching the glass. By dawn, she said, her voice a soothing balm. You were supposed to have broken me, but look at yourself. Jae-hyuk looked at his reflection in the darkened window. He saw a man who was shattered, his hair a mess, his shirt open, his eyes rimmed with red. He looked like a man who had lost a war he didn't know he was fighting. He was drained, hollowed out by the sheer effort of being the dragon. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension leaving him in a sudden, violent wave of relief. He looked back at Chiamaka, his wife, his equal, his mirror. For the first time in a decade, Jin Jae-hyuk didn't feel like a boss. He felt like a human being. The notorious boss had taken a bride for business. He had entered the room a king, and as the sun began to rise over the Han River, he sat there, broken by the quiet, dominant grace of a woman who refused to be less than his match. The dawn had come, and the dragon was finally still. The sun crept over the Seoul skyline, bleeding a pale, apologetic gold across the penthouse floor. It caught the amber liquid in the abandoned whiskey glass and turned the white silk of Chiamaka's dress into a halo of soft fire. In the center of the room, the dragon of Gangnam sat on the edge of the ottoman, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped under a weight that no amount of muscle or ink could carry. The silence was no longer the suffocating pressure of a standoff. It was the fragile stillness of a man who had finally stopped running from himself. Jae-hyuk felt the cool air of the morning on his bare chest, the dragon tattoos feeling like leaden weights against his skin. He didn't look up as he heard the soft rustle of silk. He expected Chiamaka to walk away, to claim her victory and retreat to the sanctuary of the guest wing. Instead, he felt the mattress dip beside him. She didn't touch him, not yet, but her proximity was a steadying force in a world that felt like it was tilting on its axis. The sun is up, Jae-hyuk said, his voice a dry, hollow rasp. He finally lifted his head, his sharp features softened by a fatigue that went bone deep. His eyes, usually predatory and calculating, were rimmed with red and clouded with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. You should be celebrating. You're the only person who's ever made me feel like I'm losing. Chiamaka looked at him, her expression poised and quietly dominant, but her eyes held a warmth that wasn't in the contract. She reached out, her mahogany hand contrasting beautifully against his pale, inked shoulder. She didn't pull away when he flinched. She waited until he leaned into the touch, a silent surrender. You aren't losing, Jae-hyuk, she said, her voice a melodic balm in the quiet room. You're just finally standing on level ground. You've spent so long looking down on people that you've forgotten what it's like to have someone look you in the eye. Jae-hyuk let out a short, self-deprecating ghost of a laugh. In my world, if you aren't feared, you're dead. Respect is just a polite word for terror. If my men saw me like this, if the elders saw me, they would see a man, Chiamaka interrupted, her tone firm. Fear is a fragile thing, Jae-hyuk. It's a glass wall. One crack and the whole thing shatters. But respect is a foundation. You've built an empire on shadows and threats, and that's why you can't sleep. That's why you're drained. You're holding up the ceiling with your bare hands because you don't trust the pillars. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city waking up below. The ants of Gangnam scurrying to work, unaware that their king was sitting in a heap of silk and whiskey. My father is feared in Lagos. People bow because they have to, but my mother, she was respected. When she spoke, the room didn't go silent because of a threat. It went silent because no one wanted to miss a word. Fear makes people watch your hands for a weapon. Respect makes them watch your eyes for a vision. Jae-hyuk watched her, fascinated by the way she occupied the space. She wasn't an asset. She wasn't a foreign rose to be tended. She was a force of nature. He stood up slowly, his unbuttoned shirt fluttering. He walked toward her, stopping a respectful distance away, no longer the predator closing in on prey. I don't know how to do that, he admitted, the confession feeling like a jagged stone in his throat. I was raised to be a weapon. I was taught that if I showed a single crack, I'd be discarded. Then let me be the mortar in the cracks, Chiamaka said, turning to face him. She reached out and straightened his collar, her fingers brushing against the dragon on his neck. You signed a contract for shipping routes and political leverage. But you got me, and I don't follow men who rule through fear. I lead alongside men who are strong enough to be human. For the first time in his adult life, Jae-hyuk didn't feel the need to fill the silence with a command or a threat. He looked at Chiamaka, really looked at her, and saw the partner he hadn't known he was searching for. The vulnerability was still there, a raw ache in his chest, but it was being replaced by a strange, new kind of strength. It was the strength of a man who no longer had to fight the world alone. He reached out, his hand hovering before he gently tucked a stray curl behind her ear. His touch was hesitant, almost reverent. They're going to come for us, Chiamaka. The elders, the rivals. They won't like this. They'll see you as my weakness. Chiamaka leaned into his hand, her smile small but dangerous. Then let them come. We'll show them that a dragon who is loved is far more terrifying than a dragon who is feared. The dawn was fully realized now, the light pouring into the room and washing away the ghosts of the night before. Jae-hyuk took a breath, and for the first time in 10 years it didn't feel like a struggle. He was still the notorious boss, and she was the bride taken for business, but as they stood together in the morning light, the business had become personal. He wasn't broken anymore. He was open, and as Chiamaka led him toward the balcony to watch the city rise, Jae-hyuk realized that while fear had built his throne, it was this woman's respect that would keep him on it. The break was over. The reign had begun. The traditional tea house in the Bukshin Hanok village was a place of stifling silence and ancient, unyielding rules. Here, the air did not smell of Gangnam's rain and exhaust, but of dried cedar and the sharp, medicinal scent of bitter green tea. It was a fortress of the old guard, where the syndicate elders, the Halbeaji, sat on silk cushions, their eyes like clouded marbles, weighing the soul of anyone who entered. Jin Jae-hyuk walked into the low-ceilinged room with his head held high, though every instinct screamed at him to shield Chiamaka. He had traded his unbuttoned black shirt for a formal gray suit, his tattoos hidden beneath silk and wool, but his posture remained that of a man walking into an ambush. Beside him, Chiamaka was a vibrant defiance against the muted browns of the wood. She wore a traditional Nigerian iro and buba made of deep indigo lace, the fabric shimmering with subtle beadwork. Her geli was tied with architectural precision, a crown of fabric that forced the elders to look up at her even as she knelt. The head elder, Elder Moon, did not offer a greeting. He poured tea with hands that looked like gnarled roots, the liquid hitting the ceramic with a sound like a dripping faucet in a tomb. "The dragon has returned," Moon rasped, his voice a dry parchment. "But he brings a guest who does not know our tongue, our history, or our blood. A business arrangement is one thing, Jae-hyuk, but to bring this disruption into the inner circle is an insult to the ancestors who built this seat." Jae-hyuk felt the heat rise in his chest, the dragon on his neck itching beneath his collar. He looked at Chiamaka, expecting to see the first cracks of intimidation. Instead, she sat with a spine of iron, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She didn't need to understand the Korean words to feel the venom in the tone. "The union was approved by the board for the expansion of the ports," Jae-hyuk said, his voice a low, warning vibration. "She is my wife. She is the bridge to the Atlantic. A bridge is meant to be walked upon, not sat beside." Another elder spat, his eyes raking over Chiamaka's dark skin with a naked, ugly prejudice. He shoved a bowl of bitter, steaming liquid toward her, intentionally omitting the traditional saucer. "If she is to be one of us, let her show she can endure the bitterness of our ways. Or perhaps she is only here to play the queen in your penthouse while our traditions rot." The room grew suffocating. It was a calculated humiliation, a test of whether Jae-hyuk would prioritize the purity of the syndicate's old-world racism or the woman who had broken his hollow facade only 24 hours ago. Chiamaka reached for the bowl. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She felt the weight of their gaze, the heavy, suffocating pressure of being other in a room that demanded sameness. She saw the flick of Jae-hyuk's jaw, the way his hand twitched toward the table as if to swat the bowl away. She caught his eye. A silent command passed between them. "Don't." She lifted the bowl, the heat searing her fingertips. She didn't sip. She drank it in one steady motion, the liquid as foul and abrasive as the men across from her. When she set the bowl down, not a drop had spilled. She looked directly at Elder Moon, her amber eyes burning with a quiet, dominant fire. "Tradition is a beautiful thing," she said in English, her voice melodic and unshakable. She looked at Jae-hyuk, signaling for him to translate. "But tradition without growth is just a fancy name for a grave. My ancestors survived the Middle Passage and the desert sun. Your tea is warm, but it is not a challenge." Jae-hyuk felt a surge of something he had never experienced in this room. Pride. Not the pride of a boss, but the pride of a man who realized he was standing next to a giant. He looked at Elder Moon, his sharp features hardening into a mask of lethal intent. He didn't translate her words. He replaced them with his own. "She says that you are old men clinging to a dying fire," Jae-hyuk lied, his voice echoing off the paper walls. The elders stiffened, their faces flushing with rage. "She says that the world is changing, and if you cannot respect the woman who holds the keys to your future, then you are no longer fit to lead it." "Jae-hyuk," Moon hissed, slamming his hand on the low table. "You would choose this girl over your own blood? Over the laws of the dragon?" Jae-hyuk stood up, offering his hand to Chiamaka. He didn't bow as he prepared to leave. He stood tall, the messy hair falling over his eyes, looking every bit the notorious boss who had finally found something worth protecting more than a ledger. "I am not choosing a girl," Jae-hyuk said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, final rasp. I am choosing my partner. And if the laws of the dragon cannot accommodate a queen who is stronger than all of you combined, then the dragon will find a new cave. We are leaving. He pulled Chiamaka up, and for the first time in front of the syndicate, he tucked her arm into his, a public declaration of unity that shattered every unspoken rule of the tea house. As they walked out into the crisp Seoul air, the silence behind them was deafening. The cultural warfare had begun, and the lines were drawn in the frost. You didn't have to do that, Chiamaka whispered as they reached the car, her poise finally softening into a weary gratitude. You've just declared war on your own family for me. Jae-hyuk stopped, looking at her in the afternoon light. He reached out and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing against the indigo lace of her headpiece. The vulnerability was there again, but this time it was laced with a steel resolve. They aren't my family, he said, his voice a steady vow. They're just ghosts. You're the only thing in this city that's real. If they want a war, let them have it. I've spent my life fighting for money and dirt. It's about time I fought for something that actually matters. The car door closed, shielding them from the prying eyes of the old world. Jae-hyuk had made his choice. He had stood with his bride, and in doing so, he had burned the bridge to his past. But as he looked at Chiamaka, he knew he didn't need a bridge. He had a queen, and together they were going to burn the whole map down. The war room of the Oluwaseyi estate was a stark contrast to the traditional tea house. Here, the walls were lined with monitors displaying real-time data from the Busan ports, encrypted telegram feeds, and satellite imagery of the Atlantic shipping lanes. Jin Jae-hyuk sat at the head of the table, his black shirt unbuttoned halfway, his messy hair falling over eyes that were no longer cold, but intensely focused on the woman standing at the center of the room. Chiamaka had traded the lace and the geli for a sharp, tailored black suit that fit her like a second skin. Her natural curls were pulled back into a sleek, efficient crown. She didn't look like a bride anymore. She looked like an architect of chaos. In her hand, she held a digital stylus, pointing at a map of the Incheon harbor where a rival faction, the 7-Star Circle, had been bottlenecking Jae-hyuk's supplies. You've been fighting them with muscle, Jae-hyuk, Chiamaka said, her voice a smooth, melodic resonance that commanded the room's silence. But muscle is expensive and loud. You're bleeding resources trying to outshout them at the docks. They only understand strength, Minho muttered from the corner, though he watched her with a new, guarded respect. Chiamaka turned, her amber eyes locking onto Minho's with a poise that made the veteran soldier straighten his posture. Strength isn't just a fist, Minho. It's the hand that turns off the lights before the punch is thrown. The 7-Star Circle isn't funded by the docks. They're funded by the high-interest loans they provide to the local logistics unions. If you break the bank, the soldiers stop marching. Jae-hyuk leaned back, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. He watched her navigate the complex web of Korean underworld politics with a speed that was dizzying. She wasn't just learning the names of his enemies. She was deconstructing their balance sheets. How? Jae-hyuk asked, his voice a low, appreciative rasp. I've already initiated the move, she said, tapping the screen to reveal a series of shell companies based in Lagos and London. I've bought up the debt of the 3 major unions in Incheon under an anonymous African investment firm. By dawn tomorrow, the 7-Star Circle won't be collecting interest. They'll be facing a foreclosure they didn't see coming. They'll have to pull their men off your ships just to keep their own offices open. The room went silent. It was a move so clean, so bloodless, and so devastatingly effective that it made Jae-hyuk's previous methods look primitive. He realized then that while he had been the dragon, she was the storm. He wasn't just protecting her anymore. He was being led by her. Later that evening, the boss and his queen attended a gala hosted by the city's most influential shipping magnates, the very men who had whispered about the foreign girl only days prior. As they entered the ballroom, the atmosphere shifted. Jae-hyuk walked a half-step behind her, a deliberate choice that signaled a tectonic shift in the syndicate's power structure. Chiamaka moved through the crowd with a quiet, dominant grace. When a rival boss tried to condescend to her with a remark about the difficulty of Korean business culture, she didn't flinch. She leaned in, her voice a soothing, dangerous silk. "Culture is a beautiful thing, Director Choi," she said, her Korean surprisingly accented but grammatically perfect, a gift from the long nights she had spent studying his files. "But mathematics is universal. I noticed your subsidiary in Singapore is currently over-leveraged by 15%. It would be a shame if those creditors decided to call in their favors because you were too busy worrying about my origins to manage your own house." The director's face went pale. He retreated into the crowd without another word. Jae-hyuk watched her from the periphery, a glass of whiskey forgotten in his hand. He saw the way his enemy's eyes widened when she spoke. They weren't looking at a sacrificial lamb or a strategic asset. They were looking at a woman who could dismantle an empire with a smile and a spreadsheet. She wasn't just his wife. She was becoming the most dangerous person in the room. When they finally returned to the penthouse, the adrenaline of the political theater still humming between them, Jae-hyuk caught her by the waist. He pulled her flush against him, his forehead resting against hers. The vulnerability he had shown her on their wedding night had evolved into a fierce, grounded intimacy. "You're terrifying," he whispered, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw. "They're more afraid of you than they are of me now." "Good," Chiamaka replied, her poise softening only for him. She reached up, her fingers tangling in his messy hair. "Fear is for the people who don't have a plan, Jae-hyuk. We have a plan. And I'm not just here to sit on a throne. I'm here to make sure no one ever dares to threaten what is ours." Jae-hyuk kissed her then. Not a sterile, contractual kiss, but a deep, possessive claim. He realized that the woman he had taken for business had not only broken his hollow shell but had filled it with a fire he hadn't known existed. She had stopped being the bride, and in doing so, she had saved him from the slow death of his own brutality. The dragon had found his heart, and she was deadlier than any blade he had ever carried. As they looked out over the city they were beginning to conquer together, Jae-hyuk knew that the monster of Gangnam was dead. In his place stood a man who was finally truly powerful. Because for the first time in his life he wasn't ruling alone. He was being led by the boss. The rain over Seoul had turned into a torrential downpour, the sky a bruised purple that matched the mounting tension inside the Gangnam penthouse. Jin Jae-hyuk stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his unbuttoned black shirt damp with sweat, his messy hair falling over eyes that were now wide with a rare, cold adrenaline. The monitors in the war room were flickering, a digital infection. "The servers being bypassed," Min-ho shouted over the comms, his voice crackling with static. "It's not just a hack, boss. They're inside the building. The Seven-Star Circle isn't just fighting back. They've partnered with the elders. It's a coup." Jae-hyuk's hand flew to the holster at his lower back, his dragon tattoos seeming to pulse with every ragged breath. He looked at Chiamaka. She was already at the main terminal, her fingers flying across the keys with a poise that defied the chaos outside the door. She wasn't reaching for a weapon. She was reaching for the world. "Jae-hyuk, don't go out there yet," she commanded, her voice a calm, melodic anchor in the storm. "They want you in the hallway where they can use their numbers. They think they've cut our communications, but they've only cut the ones they know about. I can't let them reach this room, Chiamaka," he hissed, his sharp features hardening. "If they get to you, the Atlantic deal dies. I die." "You won't die," she said, finally looking up. Her amber eyes were fierce, glowing with a quietly dominant fire. "And I am not a prize to be taken. I've just rerouted the building's power through the Lagos backup servers I installed yesterday. In 10 seconds, the elevators will lock, and the biometric scanners will only recognize us. But I need you to hold the service stairwell. They're coming up the hard way. Jae-hyuk felt a surge of lethal pride. He moved to the heavy reinforced door, pulling a sleek, matte black handgun from his waist. How long? 5 minutes, Chiamaka said, turning back to the screen. I'm tracing the source of the override. It's Elder Moon's private residence. I'm not just stopping the coup, Jae-hyuk. I'm bankrupting every man who signed off on it. The door erupted. The first of the 7-star hitmen burst through the service entrance, the flash of a muzzle light illuminating the dark hallway. Jae-hyuk didn't hesitate. He was a blur of violence, the monster of Gangnam reborn, but with a new, focused precision. He moved with a feral grace, his brawn meeting their steel. Every shot he fired a calculated symphony of protection. He was the shield, a wall of dragon-inked muscle and bones standing between the world and his queen. But for every man he took down, 2 more seemed to emerge from the shadows. He was being pushed back, his breathing heavy, his shirt torn and stained. He was a warrior, but he was outnumbered. Now, Jae-hyuk, step back. Chiamaka's voice rang out. He dove behind a marble pillar just as the hallway's fire suppression system engaged. Not with water, but with a concentrated burst of halon gas she had triggered from the terminal. The assassins sputtered and collapsed. Their lungs suddenly denied the air they needed to fight. The back door is clear, she said, her voice dropping back to that soothing, dangerous silk. And I just sent the Elder's private offshore transaction history to the Financial Supervisory Service. By the time those hitmen wake up, their bosses will be in handcuffs. Jae-hyuk emerged from behind the pillar, his chest heaving, his face splattered with a dark spray that wasn't his own. He looked at Chiamaka. She sat at the desk, her white slip dress still pristine, her elegant posture unchanged. She looked like a woman who had just finished a light afternoon of reading, not a woman who had just dismantled a decades-old syndicate. He walked toward her, his gun clicking as he engaged the safety. He was visibly shaken, not by the fight, but by the realization of what they were together. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched her natural curls. You broke them, he whispered, his voice a low, shattered rasp. You didn't fire a single bullet, and you broke them all. We broke them, she corrected, standing up and stepping into his space. She didn't flinch at the scent of gunpowder or the blood on his shirt. She wrapped her mahogany arms around his neck, pulling his head down until their foreheads touched. You held the line, Jae-hyuk. You gave me the time I needed to think. Your strength gave my mind a place to work. Jae-hyuk let out a long, shuddering breath, the adrenaline finally ebbing away, leaving only a profound, grounded intimacy. He had spent his life believing that power was a solo act, a burden to be carried until it eventually crushed the bearer. But as he held Chiamaka in the wreckage of his penthouse, he realized that true power was this, a partnership where the blade and the mind were one. They won't come again, Jae-hyuk said, his thumb brushing her jaw. No, Chiamaka agreed, her smile small and lethal, because they no longer have anything to come back to. We've taken their money, their secrets, and their dignity. The old guard is dead, Jae-hyuk. The rain outside began to let up, the neon lights of Seoul reflecting in the puddles like shattered jewels. The coup had failed, and in its wake, something much more formidable had risen. The shadow was gone, replaced by the dawn of a new era. The dragon and his queen stood together, looking out over the city they had just saved from itself. They were drained, they were tested, and they were dangerous. Jae-hyuk looked at his hands, the knuckles bruised, the ink dark, and then at Chiamaka, whose poise was the most terrifying weapon he had ever seen. He wasn't just a boss anymore, and she wasn't just a bride. They were a unified front, a force that the Seoul underworld would never forget. The partnership had survived its baptism in fire, and as the sirens began to wail in the distance, Jae-hyuk knew that the world was finally theirs to rule. The morning sun that rose over Seoul was different from the one that had witnessed their hollow vows. It was a searing, unapologetic white, burning through the last of the storm clouds and reflecting off the shattered glass of the penthouse. The air inside the room smelled of ozone, expensive gun oil, and the faint, sweet scent of Chiamaka's perfume. A sensory map of the war they had just won. Jin Jae-hyuk stood by the mahogany desk, his black shirt discarded, his chest bare to the light. The dragon tattoos across his skin seemed to breathe with him, no longer a heavy armor of ink, but a part of his living, weary strength. He looked at his hands, the knuckles bruised and stained, and then he looked at the heavy vellum folder resting on the blotter. It was the marriage contract, the dragon's ledger, the document that had defined Chiamaka as collateral and himself as a buyer. Chiamaka approached him, her elegant white slip dress catching the morning light. Her natural curls were loose now, framing a face that held a calm, quietly dominant presence. She didn't look like a woman who had survived a coup. She looked like a woman who had orchestrated a rebirth. She stopped beside him, her mahogany hand resting near the folder, her amber eyes searching his with a depth that no longer required words. "It's over, Jae-hyuk," she said, her voice a smooth, melodic resonance in the quiet room. "The elders are in custody. The 7-star circle is a ghost. The shipping routes are open, and your empire is secure." Jae-hyuk turned to her, his sharp features softened by a vulnerability that was now his greatest power. He reached out, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw, his touch reverent and grounded. "It isn't my empire, Chiamaka. It never was. It was just a cage I built to keep the world away. I didn't know I was building it for you to set me free." He picked up the contract. The paper felt heavy, clinical, and ancient. It was filled with clauses about transfer of assets, duration of alliance, and terms of separation. It was a masterpiece of cold, calculated business. "This is why we started," Jae-hyuk said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "A signature in a dark room. A deal made by men who think they can trade souls like cargo. But I don't want a partner who is bound to me by ink. I don't want a bride who is part of a package." He looked at her, his eyes rimmed with red but burning with a fierce, absolute clarity. "I want you, Chiamaka, by choice, every hour, every day." Without waiting for her to answer, Jae-hyuk gripped the edges of the thick vellum. With a sudden, violent grace, he ripped the contract down the center. The sound of the tearing paper was louder than the gunfire of the night before. A sharp, definitive crack that echoed through the penthouse. He tore it again, and again, until the dragon's ledger was nothing more than a pile of white confetti on the floor. Chiamaka watched the pieces fall, her expression poised but her eyes shimmering with a sudden, rare emotion. She stepped into his space, her body a warm, steady weight against his. She reached up, her fingers tracing the dragon ink on his chest, right over the heart she had tamed by dawn. "You realize what you've done?" she whispered, her voice a soothing silk. "Without that paper, you have no legal claim to my family's ports. You have no collateral to hold over my head." "I don't want a claim," Jae-hyuk replied, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against him. "I want a partner. I want the woman who broke the notorious boss and turned him into a man. If you walk out that door right now, you take half of everything I've built with you. That's the risk I'm choosing." Chiamaka leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "I'm not walking out, Jae-hyuk. I'm just getting started. But we aren't going back to the old ways. No more fear. No more ruling from the shadows." "Then how do we rule?" he asked, his breath hitching. "As equals," she said, her tone taking on that quietly dominant edge that had terrified his enemies. "Two rulers, one throne, a new empire that doesn't need a contract to stay standing." Jae-hyuk kissed her then. Not a seal on a deal, but a vow of the soul. It was a deep, possessive claim that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the man he had become in her presence. He felt the exhaustion of the decade-long war finally lift, replaced by a fierce, protective fire. They walked to the balcony together, standing on the edge of the glass kingdom. Below them, Seoul was a sea of light and motion, a city that still thought the dragon ruled alone. They had no idea that the real power was the woman standing beside him, her hand entwined in his, her poise an unbreakable shield. The notorious boss and his black bride looked out over their new world. The contract was gone, the monster of Gangnam was dead, and in his place stood a king who had finally found a queen worth kneeling for. By dawn, she had broken him. By noon, she had rebuilt him. And together, they were going to make the world forget that they ever needed a signature to be whole. The reign had truly begun, and this time, it was written in blood, light, and a love that was far more dangerous than any mafia debt. The shattered vellum of the marriage contract remained on the floor, a heap of white dust that marked the end of an era. In the quiet that followed the storm, the story of Jin Jae-hyuk and Chiamaka Adaugo Oluwaseyi reveals a truth far more potent than the violence of the Seoul underworld. That true power is not found in the ability to dominate, but in the courage to be seen. Jae-hyuk began his journey as a man who mistook control for safety. He built a fortress of ink, blood, and cold calculations, believing that vulnerability was a terminal flaw. His life was a dragon's ledger, a series of transactions where people were assets and emotions were liabilities. Yet, it took the quiet, dominant grace of a woman who refused to be a commodity to show him that a throne built on fear is merely a high-altitude prison. The moral of this narrative lies in the subversion of the hostile takeover. Chiamaka did not break Jae-hyuk with a weapon. She broke him with a mirror. By standing unshakable in her own dignity, she forced a tyrant to confront the hollow echo of his own soul. She taught him the vital distinction between being feared and being respected, that fear is a fragile, exhausting performance, while respect is a resilient foundation built on mutual recognition. This story serves as a psychological exploration of agency and the reclamation of self. It suggests that even in the darkest, most transactional environments, the human spirit cannot be fully contracted away. Chiamaka's journey from a sacrificial lamb to a co-ruler proves that poise is a deadlier weapon than any blade, and that intelligence, when paired with an iron will, can dismantle centuries of prejudice and tradition. Ultimately, the new empire rising over Gangnam is not held together by the threat of the dragon, but by the strength of a partnership. They move forward as two rulers of one throne, proving that the greatest victory is not conquering an enemy, but conquering the fear of opening one's heart. Jae-hyuk is no longer a notorious boss, and Chiamaka is no longer a business bride. They are a unified front, a testament to the fact that when we stop treating people as projects or property, we finally find the freedom to lead. The contract is gone, but the bond is unbreakable. In the end, the dragon didn't just find a queen, he found his humanity.